Hello and welcome to another episode of Prodigy Search Presents. I'm Mark Rush Jr., partner at Prodigy Search. As a follow-up to our recent PSP on interviewing, which followed resumes and cover letters, we didn't touch on enough or too much of video interviewing, and I think that deserves its own brief little segment altogether, not be lumped in with all interviewing. It turns out, obviously, interviewing through mediums like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, perhaps even Skype or other video platforms is becoming the norm. Although it's been going on for quite a while, perhaps as a first or second round version of interviews, it's continued to even the final interview stage, and will be utilized moving forward for quite a while. So, keeping in mind all of the tips and suggestions we gave on the previous presentation about interviewing in general, right, in person, and things of that nature. Let's talk about virtual interviewing. I think a lot of those things still come to play, right? Doing your homework and preparing and research ahead of time, still arriving early, obviously dressing the part, all critical. Having key answers to examples already prepared and ready to go. Having your problems, actions, and results ready to go, and then closing strong, finishing the interview, thanking everybody for their time, giving that closing argument as if you're a lawyer. So those things all still apply in the video interview setting. But let's, again, briefly, before we get to video, I think what's important is talk about phone interviews as well. Phone interviews, again, just like video and virtual interviews, them. Obviously, over the phone, you can't see facial expressions, so that's a little bit tough. But let's talk about some nonverbal and verbal things to do over the phone. Obviously, making sure you're in a quiet area, making sure that the volume is turned up. Obviously, that there are no interruptions in terms of background noise, that they can hear everything you're saying into your microphone. Make sure your Bluetooth is charged, your AirPods, whatever you're using are charged, and the volume's turned all the way up so they can hear you. I recommend doing phone interviews, and frankly, we'll get to this in the video setting in a second as well. Doing phone interviews standing up, if at all possible, and still utilizing the same cues you normally would over the phone. In person or over video, over the phone. So you still can smile, you still can laugh, you still can do those things. You can't do eye contact over the phone, but nonetheless, over the phone, I still think you can succeed by having a few different tips and tricks at your disposal. Having things written out, you can bring your resume to a phone interview. Nobody will see it, obviously. You can bring up a company's website on a phone interview. And again, if there's some sample answers to interview questions, you can have them out on a phone interview as well. But let's talk about the video interview and the virtual interview side of things, because I think it is a tremendous challenge, but it can be a tremendous opportunity. First and foremost, make sure the camera is working. Make sure it's in a well-lit area. Make sure your microphone is also working. So test those out. You want to be clear. You don't want those distractions to be in play. Obviously, you want to test the Wi-Fi. Make sure the internet connection is solid. Again, in today's day and age, I know that's not a problem, but I've also instructed people, if you're doing a video interview for a job, make sure you don't have 10 other devices in your house that are using that, whether that be streaming on TV, cell phones, whatever other devices you may have. If you have all those devices as once, well, you're just sapping that Wi-Fi as well from your Teams, your Zoom, or your Skype platform. So making sure that the Wi-Fi and the audio and video work well. I was once doing a presentation, if you can believe that, earlier this year, on how to do a video interview. And I was talking about testing the system out, right? Making sure it all worked ahead of time. And the organizer of that event, interestingly enough, didn't allot for enough time in the Zoom session and only had a certain amount of time set aside. And the Zoom session was canceled about halfway through my speech on video interviewing. And she made my point, which was, again, making sure you're prepared ahead of time, setting aside enough time, making sure that technology doesn't fail us, because that's what technology does, right? Failing us when we need it the most. And so I would say, if you have the opportunity to do test calls on platforms like Skype, or record yourself on platforms like Zoom, record yourself, see how you're answering, see how the verbal, nonverbal, how are you using your hands, how's your eye contact. Those things are all critical. If you can tell by this conversation right now in particular, what I have, just by way of a few tips and suggestions, is the light actually is pointing behind the camera and even on and over top of the camera. So I look well lit, but I do not have any lights behind me as well. So if you don't have any of the fancy lighting technology, you can still utilizing some areas in and around your home or your office by having the lights pointing in the right direction. Also, eye contact is critical. So most of our cameras are right above the top of our laptop or desktop, or if it's an external one, certainly you can position a little bit differently. But I would say one tip that I've suggested to most people is minimizing the screen that you're looking at or that you're appearing on, excuse me, and moving it right below the camera at the highest part of your monitor, having it appear right at the very top so that your eye contact is almost the very top of the screen. This is the same as if you're giving a speech, by the way, in person. If you're talking in a crowded room of people and it's difficult or challenging for you to have eye contact with everybody in the room, look at the tops of their heads is a tip I've utilized. Same thing in this scenario, right? So looking at the top of your laptop or desktop screen actually gives the eye contact almost a perfect dead-on view of how the Zoom or Teams or Skype interview platform and video platform allows you to practice that. But I would practice, record it, watch yourself back, and try to correct some of those mistakes. But just like an in-person interview, I would say the most critical things are how you dress, right? So still dressing formally despite it being a video and virtual interview. Eye contact, if you can acknowledge the other people that are on a call. If it's a panel video interview, you can still acknowledge them. Might be harder for you to give eye contact, but point them out by name because most people will have their names listed out on a video, a virtual interview. So acknowledge them, because in a normal setting, you can look to the right, you can look to the left, and you can acknowledge them in a boardroom, but you might not be able to do that in a virtual setting. But again, I would say to the extent that you can, treat everything like you would in a normal interview setting. Always assume the camera is on, always assume the microphone is hot. Getting in there early, making sure that the camera is turned off and unmuted until it's time to perform, and then in which case make sure your camera is on and that you're unmuted. And at the end of the interview, make sure that the interview is actually over. The meeting has been concluded. You don't want to be caught on the hot video, the hot mic. Again, I would say some basics as well. Although I'm not behind a plain background, make sure you have a plain background behind you. It doesn't mean it needs to be a blank wall, but somewhat plain, not distracting. And then no virtual backgrounds as well. That doesn't work for a job interview. I would say move and steer clear of that if at all possible. You can have notes written down. You're not meant to be robotic on a video interview. You can have a pad, portfolio to write notes down or questions, or to look down and to think about the question you'd like to ask the interviewers. I would say there's one tip or trick I would give, and I'll close it with this for a virtual interview. And I had somebody tell me this, so I can't take this and pawn it off as my own. What they did, which they thought helped them because they were a nervous video interviewer. They were very conscientious of how they looked, how they sounded on video, and they didn't think they performed best. But what they helped do to ease their nerves was they actually had Post-it notes around the perimeter of their laptop or desktop screen with a few pieces of information to remind them of a certain answer they wanted to give or a certain question that they wanted to ask. It was friendly reminders that they wouldn't be looking too far off screen or too much down, but they could avert their eyes for just a split second and say, okay, that was something I wanted to bring up on the interview. It was a question I wanted to ask, or it was a point I wanted to address for my resume, or to showcase that I did research on the company. And it was Post-it notes around the perimeter of their screen, of their laptop or desktop screen. So again, just some tips and tricks on how to really execute a virtual interview really well, especially if this goes on for a long time coming. We all need to become experts at this, and it's not going to happen overnight, but practice makes perfect. So good luck on your next Zoom, Teams, or Skype interview.